Many of you know me. I'm Ian Vega, Professor at the European Institute. I think we're all delighted to be joined by Klaus Welle, who has, I think, now appointed to the European Institute as a visiting professor. You're very welcome here in that capacity as well. We'd like to ask if you have these silly mobile phones to switch them off. You don't want to ring in the middle of the meeting. And I think it's worth pointing out as well that there's going to be an online presentation of this, and it's possible we'll hear questions from somewhere out in cyberspace at some point. For those of you who are dedicated X users, it's used to be called Twitter, we'll go next to the hashtag LSEEI. And the theme tonight is the fact that we have European elections forthcoming, which could be just a bit more delicate than usual, because the sense of coalition between the two main parties, the S&D, Social Democrats, and the EPP, the European People's Party, could well be broken, which could have far-reaching ramifications for the ability of the Parliament to fulfill its job. So, that said, I'm going to leave Klaus to do the introductions to it. He used to be Secretary General of the European Parliament a couple of years ago. And it's worth pointing out to you that although there are members of the European Parliament, 700 and whatever it is, it's the background staff who do most of the work. And the Secretary General is the person who has to make sure these things happen. He told me there are something like 5,000 members in the staff compared with the 700 or so members. Now, this professor here, he's had many roles in the Parliament, and I think you don't need to go on and on about your biography. Just give you the floor. Ask you to give us your views.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. To a certain extent, it's a continuation and an update of a talk I gave already nearly half a year ago in the seminar of NDET's Day. And if some of you were present there, so some of the points will be known to you, but others are fresh and updated. And I can maybe say I was politically educated in the 1980s by speeches of Helmut Kohl, and whatever was the topic, he was saying the same thing. So it will not be that bad, but maybe you have then the chance to reflect again and we can discuss. So what I would like to go through today is some pre-remarks about the European Union system. That's very important for me because normally that's not properly understood. It's normally not properly understood because people like to think in analogies of the national system they know, which is a shortcut. You know, we all like shortcuts. If it's the same, then we don't have to learn something new. But if it's fundamentally different, then it's a dangerous shortcut. So that's why I would like to explain this a little bit. Secondly, on the European elections, what results to be expected now? Both in terms of figures, but also in terms of what does it mean for the functioning of the system in the future. Thirdly, what are the consequences? In how far will the system be changed? Four, a special look on the radical right and how the setup might change over there. Five, small excursion into geopolitics, and then what would be the consequence of this for the next legislation. So the first remark, and that's something that's very important from my point of view, we have to understand that the European Union is a division of power system. So it's not a fusion of power system. The national systems we know are fusion of power systems. You have a parliamentary majority, you have an executive, and it's the same majority. And if parliament is no longer following the proposals, if they're important by the government, parliament is dissolved, there are no elections, and the whole thing restarts. That's one relationship. And that's a parliament which is pretty dependent, if you want to be nice, you say interdependent, but I would say pretty dependent on the executive. because the key figures of the political parties are sitting in government. Starting with the prime ministers, the political leader, ministers, and so on. That makes the European Parliament different. We do not follow automatically. The Commission is proposing something. We say yes, no, maybe 500 amendments, or we just wait for a year or two. And some dossiers are hanging around for quite some time. So this European Parliament, and that's what I want to say, is free as an actor. It's not dependent on the executive. It takes its own strategic decisions. And it negotiates permanently with the Council of Ministers and the Commission, like the House, the Senate, and the administration do in the United States. And why do we have such a system? What is the sense? The sense is, if you have to organize a continent with 440 million people, 27 states, people having very different historical experiences, religious backgrounds, neighbors, you cannot run this continent on a basis of 51 against 49. And even if that just could be for 4 years. So in these kind of complex constructions of a continental scale, like in the United States, like in the European Union, you have to give many chances to be heard. And you have to divide the decision-making capacity between different actors. Parliament, Council, and the Commission. Therefore, decision-making is more slow, but once a decision is taken, it's solid. And let's not forget, this is a system based on free will. You can join, but you can also leave, as Britain has demonstrated. So if you run this on 51-49, you are annoying a lot of people on a regular basis. So it's better to give more people a hearing. That's why the system is built as it is. But think about the parliament to be elected is a free actor. Secondly, we like to think of elections again like national elections, where we have a party which we are voting, or we are voting for another party. It will be straightforward. That's not the case in the European Union, because you are voting for national parties or regional parties in the national union. And what's then coming together in the European Parliament is the outcome of 27 separated political decisions. All together then, this is forming the EPP or the S&P group or the EU. This is then one entity, but it's based on 27 different elections, partly with very different rules even. So what is the consequence? The consequence is that the European elections are decided before election day, on election day, and after election day. Before election day, because it depends on the strength of the alliance you can build in the run-up to the election, through membership decisions. There's a national party that applies, you take them, you don't take them, and so on. And the stronger the alliances you are building over time through membership decisions, the more likely it is that you have a good result at the election day. And here I can speak of personal experience. I was from 94 to 99 Secretary General of the European People's Party, transnational party. And partly I was sent there by Chancellor Kohl, German Chancellor, who was frustrated that the socialists were winning all the elections. So, which is normal because he's a Christian Democrat, you know. We all always want to win. So he was frustrated and he wanted me to change this. So how do you change this? You change this through mergers and acquisitions. Fortunately, I studied economics, so I was allowed to think in terms of mergers and acquisitions. So you build up a stronger network. That meant in our case, French Gaulists, Forza Italia, PSD, Portugal, a more open process in selecting partners in Central Eastern Europe, and that changed the majorities for a quarter of a century. Just saying this also to not underestimate European political parties and not to judge them on the functions of national political parties, because they have their own functions which are very important. By the way, on the socialist side, the acceptance of the Democratic Party from Italy is something very similar, because the Democratic Party of Italy were not really socialist. They had Christian Democrats, left-wing Christian Democrats, and former communists. So a kind of compromise was, okay, we go there, even though we are not really socialist. What take the liberals? Last elections, they decided to accept the members of President Macron, even though President Macron told them very clearly, I'm not a liberal, but I want to join your group. Why didn't you want to be a liberal? Because if you are liberal in France, you have the chance between 2 and 3% of the vote. Liberal is a kind of hate word in the French political system. So what I want to say is elections are decided also by the alliance you built before. They're decided on election day, and they're decided after the election, because about 50 members elected to the parliament normally don't have to have a political family. They have to decide in which group are they going. It's a kind of decision, as a kind of competition. Many are going to the very right, which is why they didn't have a home before, but some are not. So elections are decided at 3 moments in time, and that makes them systematically different from national elections we know. Third point or fourth point, there are political groups. If you look at the statistical average, the well-established groups are voting 95% together. But let's not forget, there are many technical votes in this. So when it's very tough, when it's very hard, maybe the degree of cohesion is not 100%, it's not 95%, it's not 90%, it's maybe only 85%, or it's maybe 80%. Different to a national political group, where when you are not following the group, the line of the party on a 3-line whip, you're excluded. You might lose your party membership, let's say in Westminster, for example. So the possibilities to discipline are much more lower, because you're coming from a national system where your re-election and your future is decided. So I'm making this pre-remarks because it's important for the following. So, second point, what results are to be expected? First thing is participation could increase for a second time, which is important for the legitimacy not only of the European Parliament and the Commission. How do we know this? Because there are opinion polls where people are asked, how likely is it that you go to vote? Is it likely? Is it very likely? The figure as such is not important, but it is important if you compare to 5 years ago, and this figure is 9% up for the moment. Early days, not to be too optimistic, but it could be that participation is going further up, especially because citizens see that over the last 15 years, key issues are being dealt with on the European level, like COVID, like Ukraine, like financial crisis, like uncontrolled migration. On the political parties, there are aggregated data available. There's the political figures, but there are other figures as well. And then you need to assume a bit, okay, where could these 50 others end up, which is possible if you know a bit the political landscape. So to put it in a nutshell, I think it's relatively likely that the EPP and the Socialists, the 2 biggest parties, will remain about as strong as they are now. So my best guess for the EPP is 180 seats. That's a bit higher than you find in the opinion polls, but have a look, for example, at the Dutch political scene, which is in restructuring, where some of the parties don't yet have a formal home. So there's additional space. So I think 180 is a good figure. I would put the socialist group at about 140 seats. So that's about 40 different. Can it still change? Of course it can. But I think this is already relatively stable. Of course, there can be deviation on election day, but my past experience tells me not more than 15 seats in the one or in the other direction. Then we have the figures for the Greens and for the Liberals, and for the Greens and the Liberals, the figures are seriously down. There are two reasons. One, 2019, they were inflated because of the British Brexit reaction. So you had a very good result for the British Greens, you had a very good result for the Liberal Democrats. And of course, if we compare 2019 to 2024, they are in. So that will no longer be the case. And we see that the Macron party, which boosted the results last time, is nowadays much weaker. And the Spanish Liberal Party, Ciudadanos, is more or less the same. So that means we will have depressed figures for the Liberals. We will have most probably depressed figures for the Greens. And who is winning those seats? The right and the extreme right. That means we have a shift with Liberals and Greens reduced, about 40 seats probably, and the right and the extreme right winning, maybe even together about 760 seats, because Parliament is going to be bigger from 705 to 720. So there are 15 additional seats in the European Parliament. So this has some consequences. When you look at the outcome of European elections since 1979, there was not a single election where the left and the Liberals included didn't make it to roughly 50%. There's different composition, the Greens are more recent appearance, but they were 50% together or more. This time could be the first election where they are clearly below 50% at about 45%. Wait to see whether that is happening, but if that's happening, it's significant. The second element, and this is of institutional importance, is that the center which has been stabilizing the system, not only for the European Parliament, also towards the Commission, and I would see this enlarged center as the Socialists, the EPP, and the Liberals. This center is shrinking again and could be reduced to only about 55%. In 1999, nearly 75%, now 55%. Admitted in 1979, about 65%. But where it is now, this is a historical low. So roughly 55%. And why do I call them the stabilizing center? Because these are the political families who have traditionally taken responsibility to provide qualified majorities, which means the absolute majority in the House, the majority of members elected, which you need at certain occasions, and especially for the election of a Commission President. For the election of a Commission President, you need 50% plus one vote. And the political families that have traditionally provided this majority is EPP, Socialist, Liberal, and they go down to 55% only. So what is the consequence? I said in the beginning that group cohesion is not 100%. It's maybe not 90%. Maybe it is 85%. Maybe it's 80%. But the consequence, if these three groups should really end up together only with 55% of the seats, EPP, Socialist, Liberals, is that with a likely vote which is maybe 85% cohesion. Think about Ursula von der Leyen has been nominated at the EPP Congress, her own political family with 81%. So if there is 85% cohesion, which is maybe realistic and it's not a bad result, it means that these three groups cannot guarantee again the election of the Commission President. And that's new. That's the first. So what is the consequence? The consequence is that the election of the Commission President is in danger. Let's take as an example, it would be again Ursula von der Leyen. She last time won the election in the European Parliament with a majority of 8 votes. If the key supporting political families are shrinking by 30, and if the parliament is growing from 705 to 720, so you need overall, you need 361 votes now, it means that everything else equal, she doesn't start with +8, she starts with -30. So that means either you have a completely different group cohesion in these three groups, or she needs to reach out to other political families outside the traditional families of EPP, Socialists and Liberals. And there are basically 2 options. The one option is that she's reaching out to what could be called the constructive right, which is especially Meloni, Fratelli, and so on. Why do I call them constructive right? Because they have been engaging in deal making over the last years, for example, finding an agreement on migration policy, or to the Greens, or to both. What are the difficulties? The difficulty is that the Greens, the last 4 times, have not supported a Commission President. They did not vote Ursula von der Leyen, even though she proposed the Green Deal. They did not support Jean-Claude Juncker, even though he was quite a left-leaning Christian Democrat. They did not support Barroso II, and they did not support Barroso I. So what I want to say is, this is not a foregone conclusion. So if these votes are not available, then the question is, can she have the votes of what I've called the constructive right, in differentiation from a right which tries to be system opposition and rather destructive. When it is true, and of course we have to wait for the figure, but if it is true that she starts with -30, if it is her, you can see that this is the moment of maximum leverage for the European Parliament. Because there's a candidate who wants to be elected, maybe it's her, maybe it's somebody else, we don't know who it is. And you need the absolute majority +1 vote. And so why should people vote for her? So there are 3 questions. The first question is, what about the program? What can you offer us in terms of program? The second is, what can you offer to us in terms of people or nominations? What about our commissioners? What is going to be their portfolio? Are they responsible for the language services or for climate change, for example? Because she distributes the portfolios. And 3, will you respect Parliament as an institution? And when Parliament says, will you respect us, it means, could we be upgraded? Last time, the outcome was de facto the right of legislative initiative. I was first meeting on a Monday morning, 9 o'clock in Brussels. And she said, can you give me some advice? And I said, look, one advice I can give you, if you are the candidate where we are falling backwards in institutional relations because you have not been a Spitzenkandidat, you will not be elected. So you have to compensate. And many political groups were asking at the time that she should promise, which she did, that if Parliament passes a legislative own initiative report, the Commission would propose that legislation. So de facto introduction of the legislative initiative right of the European Parliament, which is something which is important. So we can expect something similar. I would say, what are the minimum conditions? The minimum conditions for support from, let's say, the Meloni area will surely be on issues of migration, because that's the key Italian issue inside. The minimum condition of the Greens, I don't know whether it's sufficient, will surely be a reassurance for the continuation of the Green Deal. So we could say Green Deal 2. To get reassurances from the Commission that there would be serious efforts continued on the Green Deal. When you read the preparation of the Liberals for their Congress on the 20th of March, their focus is clearly on competitiveness. I say clearly on competitiveness because everything you can read in their Congress preparation is on competitiveness. So that's pretty easy. On the socialist side, their lead candidate has been very much engaged for minimum wage in the European Union. So it's very clear that they will ask some tangible progress on the social side, and of course also on the Green Deal. And on the EPP, we see besides agriculture and competitiveness, I think a stress on the issue of defense. So that means you have a candidate, a woman or a man, with his or her own obsessions, but in order to get elected, he or she has to agree on a program with the different political leaders in the European Parliament and with the European Parliament altogether. So this is a parliament that is involved in agenda setting, not just receiving what the Commission is proposing, what maybe we are reading in textbooks. The Commission has the right of initiative. These are processes of negotiations. So a word on the structure, on the spectrum, on the right of the EPP. Why is this important? It is important because since 2009, in small, relatively small steps, but all the time repeated, this sector has been growing, and it can be expected that this kind of political space will represent about 30% of the members of the European Parliament. So last time 25%, my guess is roughly 30% of the European Parliament. So it is very important how this is structured, how this is organized. Is this one block? Is it two blocks? Is it three? What is motivating them? Are they trying to destroy the system, or are they trying to constructively engage with their contents? That's normal, but nevertheless constructively engage. The current dividing line on the right between the European conservatives and reformists and identity and democracy is basically foreign policy. ECR is pro-American, and ID group, when it was established, maybe the Ukraine war has changed things a little bit, clearly focused on Russia. So the dividing line, why this is not one block, one of the important elements is foreign policy orientation. ECR group oriented on America, ID group oriented on Russia, with some modifications with the recent experience. Is it going to remain the same or not? It's an open question. But I see two new dividing lines. When you have a look at the ID group on the very right of the political spectrum, you now have a conflict between Marine Le Pen and the German AfD. And what is this conflict about? This conflict is about kind of secret meeting that happened with important AfD participation, including the lead candidate for the European elections, where they were discussing about remigration of millions of Germans because they believe they don't have the proper background. So they are from immigration background or whatever. So they were discussing remigration and encouraging remigration. What encouraging means, okay, then I leave to your philosophy, but without wanting to draw false parallels, in the 1930s, the Jewish population was also encouraged to go somewhere else. It's quite serious. And Marine Le Pen has said that she doesn't accept this. She wants a clarification. She had a meeting with the AfD party leader, Madame Weidel. She had asked for a written document, and she said it's not enough. Her interest is to be presentable for the 2027 presidential elections in France. What she doesn't need is a party which is radicalizing further, which is the situation where the German AfD is. So there is within that group suddenly a dividing line which could lead to a restructuring of that political space. There's a second dividing line in the ECR group, so the oriented towards America, between the Polish Law and Justice and the other ones. Because Law and Justice, since they were defeated by Donald Tusk at the latest, is radicalizing quite quickly. So it could be that we are seeing a reorganization of that political space with one group around Madame Meloni, then another one which could bring the Polish Law and Justice together with Marine Le Pen, together with Viktor Orban, together with Vox and some others, and the AfD outside a formal group structure. That's speculation, but I just want to say these dividing lines which have structured that political space maybe could be drawn in a different way in the next legislature. And it is important for the stability of the system how many members in this space will engage in a constructive way and how many will not. A small similar issue is with the 5 stars in Italy who are still without group affiliation. I think it is time that they find a political group. That political group will be on the left. It could be the Greens, it could be the Socialists, but difficult with the Democratic Party, or it could even be the left. But there is an additional about 15 seats, 10 to 15 seats on the left side available. So this is a bit the setup for the next legislature. I believe that in the next legislature, geopolitical issues will become extremely important. We have come from 30 years ago from a situation where we thought we are surrounded by friends to a situation where nowadays we are nearly surrounded by problems. When we look at Russia, we don't need to go very much into detail, but it is clear that whereas the West and the center of Europe is structured by the European Union, which then has contractual relations with Britain, with Switzerland, with Norway, and so on, but with the principles of equal partnership, Russia is trying to reintroduce the policy of empire. Empire means submission, with military means, with violence. By the way, empire is our own past. It's maybe Russia's presence, but it's our own past. When we don't need to go very far backwards, and we find the British Empire, the French Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the Ottoman Empire, even the Germans tried in the 20th century to have lately an empire. So our history is not contrary to our imagination, the sovereign nation state. Our history is empire. And Russia tries to reintroduce the principles of empire in the European continent. It's very important for our future, whether that succeeds or not. I would say better not. We have to expect in this period also, I think, a peace settlement for Ukraine, where the way this will be done will be crucial for the security of also the member states of the European Union. We have China, which is in a conflict with the United States, which in its structure is very similar to the conflict structure in Europe before the First World War, where you have the up-and-coming industrial power, starting a big fleet building program, Kaiser Wilhelm at the time, nowadays China, challenging the established sea and industrial power at the time Britain, nowadays United States. And we see more or less every week that boats collide, airplanes are in danger of colliding. So will this explode, or can this be, let's say, moderated in a peaceful way? It will have huge consequences on our future. And last but not least, not to forget the presidential elections in the United States. If Donald Trump should be elected president of the United States, I think that we will have very, very fundamental questions in the transatlantic alliance to face. Much worse than last time, because last time he was a bit unprepared. There were the grown-ups, lots of generals and so on. There was an established community. He didn't have his own staff in all the leadership functions. This time he will. So how will we find ourselves with Russia, with China, and potentially under a Trump presidency with major challenges? And that means we have to invest much more thought also into European defense. I can maybe say that I've just coordinated for the Martin Center a product on European defense with 9 experts from all over Europe, which is also available on the internet. But the issue of European sovereignty will become a new meaning. And in this relation, and in this context, also the question of relation between the United Kingdom and Europe on security issues. So to put it into a nutshell, we are as a system under attack from the outside, geopolitically, but we are as a system also under attack from the inside. We need to thoroughly reflect also why this is the case, what is changing voting behavior. We have an unresolved divide between countryside and big cities. You had this in, we have this in the vote during Brexit and in the parliamentary elections of the so-called Red Wall. But have a look at presidential elections, second round in France. You have the big cities falling for Macron, and all the countrysides going for Le Pen. So we have an unresolved issue, big cities, countryside. When you have a look at earnings, the 10% lowest earners basically for decades didn't have a real wage increase, or very, very little. So the span between the higher earnings and the lower ones has very much widened. And when I just had to look 2 days ago on German growth, after the Second World War, 5%, goes down in a straight line now to, on average, 0%. So we have an issue with the economy. We have an issue with parts of the population which are rebelling against how the system is currently functioning. We are challenged from the outside and from the inside at the same time. I hope this was interesting for you. I hope I didn't repeat myself too much. If I did repeat, I hope it was interesting. Thank you very much.
Wow. Where should I move to? Antarctica? Australia?
Greenland, because von der Leyen is currently in Greenland.
So that's her ploy to get the Greens on board, is it? Move to Greenland. I'm going to ask a couple of questions first before opening up to the rest of you. The first one is purely on the arithmetic. I think you said, correct me if I'm wrong on this, EPP 180, S&D 140, and Liberals and Greens 40. Is that 40 each?
No, losing together.
What's the Liberal projection then?
I would say 85,
All right,
maybe 90.
because I thought I'd understood 40, which would only have, not the 55 you mentioned with the deductions. Right, well, that's clarified that one. A second question I have is a traditional one of the fact that European Parliament elections are fought on national issues. Is that still the case?
I mean, we had the data after the 2019 elections. Do I need this here? Or do I need this? Do I need to speak it?
Yes, because we're
Yeah,
broadcasting.
yeah.
Actually, we can hear you.
Yeah, you can hear.
Yeah,
well.
we can.
Okay. We had data in the European Parliament administration after the 2019 elections. And they did show that, in fact, we had kind of regional issues which were decisive. So in the north and in the center of Europe, the key issue which was motivating people during their vote was climate change. In the south, it was migration, and in the east, social issues. So national issues doesn't cover it anymore very well. But it's not the case that for the whole 440 million, they are following the same European issues. We have this divide. We had this divide at least between climate change, between social issues, and between migration in the south, in the center north, and in the east. I personally think what has changed is that people are now understanding that very often the very big issues are landing on Brussels decision-making tables. From Ukraine to COVID, to uncontrolled migration 2015, to the financial crisis. So 20 years ago, it was probably fair to say that European Union was not directly affecting people's life. Indirectly, yes, over 5-10 years through regulation. But I think that is changing, and that has also led last time to increased participation, because people have the impression that these are issues that are touching them in their own life in a more direct way.
Last question, and I'll come to the audience. You mentioned Ursula von der Leyen as the Spitzen candidate most likely to be in pole position to win. That would be a 5th consecutive EPP Commission presidency. Is that a problem in its own right?
For some, yes. I wouldn't see it as a problem. But I mean, it depends on strengths in both chambers. Who decides? So who decides? The European Council. In the European Council, at the moment of decision making, there will be very likely 13 prime ministers will be EPP, because there will be an incoming Portuguese prime minister, even though he doesn't have a stable majority, but he will be the prime minister at the time. And in Bulgaria, there will be a changeover because there's a coalition which agreed after 9 months to change. There will also be an EPP prime minister. So there will be 13 prime ministers at the moment of decision making, of 27 from the EPP. And I didn't count exactly, but I think the socialists have maybe 4 or 5, and the liberals have 4 and 5, and the other ones are to the right of the EPP. So that's, let's say, at least a comfortable starting point for that debate, and I think in the European Parliament as well. So I personally believe if that result comes out like this, there will be an EPP prime minister. But I've also been saying this in a talk in 2019, there are kind of informal preconditions for Spitzenkandidaten to be successful. And what are they? If you are a candidate from the center right, you also need to be at least acceptable, if not attractive, on the center left. If you are a candidate from the center left, you need to be at least acceptable, if not attractive, on the center right. And we have to understand that, and that I think Ursula von der Leyen fulfills. She was sometimes more supported on the center left than on the center right, to be honest. You can see this in State of the Union speeches. I could see this because I was sitting beside the president. So she is fulfilling that, a little bit similar to Jean-Claude Juncker, was a very left-leaning EPP candidate. The second is, we are not a parliamentary democracy. So you cannot optimize this process just looking at parliament composition. You need to choose candidates for their ability to be accepted both in the parliament and in the European Council. And that was the case with Jean-Claude Juncker, because he was for 30 years hanging around in the council, but it was not the case with the candidates that were presented in 2009. But it is the case with Ursula von der Leyen. So I would say she fulfills the informal preconditions for success, which is electability also on the other side of the political divide. And secondly, the European Council will not say she's not able to do the job, which they said in 2019. But this principle of Spitzenkandidaten is now confronted by a new challenge. And this is that the system stabilizing majority of EPP, Socialists and Liberals who have been doing this ever since the European Union is created, and which is an absolute necessity, from my point of view, will no longer be sufficient. Therefore, the question is, can she get support beyond or not?
I have many other questions, but let's go to the room and see if there's any questions coming up. You say briefly who you are as well as what your question is. Do we have any microphone?
So apparently we don't need it, but I'll check here.
Hi, my name is Jonas. I'm an alumni. I now work in European country risk. I do a bit of European elections coverage. I'm interested in the other jobs. We've talked a lot about von der Leyen and the Commission President. But of course, there's probably going to be a new head of the European External Action Service, European Parliament, and the Council, of course. Are we going to get 4 women, 5 women, or what's your column? What's your column? The other positions?
I mean, when we compare the current office holders, then I would say the women have not performed too badly. In fact, they have performed extremely well. My impression is that the socialists are looking at the president of the European Council. Personal speculation would be still Costa from Portugal. I think that the Liberals then could be interested in the High Representative. They would have an excellent candidate with Kaja Kallas from Estonia. Of course, the question is, if you take a frontline country like Estonia, something maybe that could be a bit radical towards Russia. I personally don't, but some might. That's already a debate we are having with the Secretary General of NATO, where people now, some bigger countries prefer Rutte rather than having somebody from the Baltic countries or from Poland. But personally, I think that Kaja Kallas would be outstanding, would be extremely good, would be clear. So that could be the balance found in the system. On the President of Parliament, my impression is that Roberta Metsola is enormously supported in Parliament. She goes far beyond the EPP, both to the right and to the left, with charismatic leadership. And I have the impression, I can be wrong, that the satisfaction in Parliament with her is quite high. So it could be that she's prolonged for another half term, and then the second half term goes to another political family.
I'm equally impressed with her limited amount of scenery. We'll take a couple of questions now. We normally do them in 3s, but I think in the smaller audience we do 2 at a time. Will you let me know if there's any online? Yeah.
Hi. My name is Leo. I'm a student. I've got many questions, but unfortunately, I'm going to just make 2. First question. Yeah, so what parties are willing to put forward programs that would include the integration of AI further into politics?
What?
Into AI.
Artificial intelligence.
Sorry?
Artificial intelligence.
Yes.
And your second question was?
My second question. Uh, So regarding the European Travel Information and Authorization System, or ETS, do parties agree to where the money collected for such a system will be allocated?
Very technical question. I think maybe we'll drop that one if you don't mind.
On the second, I'm definitely not competent. On AI, the question is, as an issue to be treated politically, all of them, or is the reference to be used in the campaigning? It's maybe something else, but if your question is, are they all ready to deal with artificial intelligence as an issue politically in the next legislature? I think the answer is yes. I don't see a differentiation there between political.
Sure.
Michal?
My name is Michal. I do political economy here at LSE. And I wanted to ask, as the Le Pen is increasing the gap in the polls in France, can you speculate a bit more on the right side of the parliament composition, how she will play with Meloni, with Orban? Yeah, a bit more.
Yeah, let's take a second question here.
Hi, my name is Adela. I work in EU public affairs. And we're speaking a bit about the concessions that Commission President would have to make to the political groups. And I wanted to ask, what about the Parliament as a whole institutionally? What concessions could she be looking at there?
There's two not quite additional complementary questions, but I'm sure you could answer both of them.
Yes. Okay, on the institutional questions, last time it was right of initiative. Personally, I expect that there will be a renegotiation of the framework agreement between the Commission and the Parliament, which was last time dealt with 10 years ago and before 15 years ago, but not 5 years ago. What then the political groups will put in as demands, that's maybe a bit early, but I would expect that the framework agreement is one of the issues. Maybe one topic more precisely, I think something Parliament has been asking for a very long time is the right of inquiry, inquiry committees for this to be strengthened. And I could imagine that this is something, but that involves the member states as well. So ideally, Parliament will be looking at something like last time, where the Commission President candidate can commit and deliver at the same time. And inquiry committee does not exactly fall into this category. Then the other question about Le Pen. And Meloni, exactly. The answer is we of course, we have no idea what they are doing, but we know what is their interest. I think the interest of Meloni is clearly to be a player, to be constructive. Italy has many interests with the European Union, not only next generation EU, also migration. So she has not opted for system opposition, which might have been a possibility, but she has opted for constructive engagement. And I think to a certain extent, she has also profited from the fact that in the European Council, the German and the French position have not been so strong recently. So she has been filling in to the surprise of many, not so much to my surprise, I can say at this point. She has been filling in a hole, a void, a vacuum. Find it interesting that now 2 Italians, for example, are asked to deliver reports on competition with Enrico Letta and Mario Draghi. So she has moved Italy from the fringes, from the sidelines, right into the center of European Union politics. So I cannot see why she should abandon this. My personal assumption is that she will continue on this way because it has been successful for herself, but also for her country. Marine Le Pen tries to demonstrate that she that she could govern France. So she has changed her program a little bit, and she wants to win in 2027. That means she could also be interested to be perceived more and more as moderating. Maybe a small thing, but traditionally, the R in the party name in France is linked to Gaullism. So I think she tries to conquer that mantle as well on the right, even though her own party has no Gaullist tradition, not at all, but I think she tries to do that. So she will not want to be associated with political forces that create problems for her in the presidential election campaign 2027. And the trajectory on which the German AfD is for the moment is a trajectory of further radicalization. So therefore, I think she could have an interest to separate herself from the AfD party in Germany. But this is speculation, but you asked for the motivations. I think these are the motivations. What organizational consequences they're having is not clear, but it's an indication that the current setup does not necessarily have to continue. And that we might see either immediately or with some time delay, a kind of reorganization on the radical right.
You mentioned Draghi and Letta being the high priests now of competition policy. I think you're saying that Meloni and Le Pen are becoming a different German word, pragmatisch.
On Le Pen, I hope I've not said that she's becoming pragmatisch, because I had the privilege to observe her from very close in my function in the European Parliament, and pragmatisch I would never associate with
Well, my Le Pen story is one of my early projects in the European Parliament. Came to this elevator, the days when you could move around without difficulties, and out came Jean-Marie Le Pen. And he was enormous, big paratrooper. The next day it was Ian Paisley, same lift. Right, we have a couple of questions over here, I think. Okay, one online, two.
Can I start? Okay, we have a question from Richard Corbett, a former MEP. Are you not too cautious about the number of votes that von der Leyen might get? One reason for the narrow majority last time was the fact that she had not been announced as a candidate before the election, causing some socialists and liberals to vote against. That, at least, will not be an issue this time.
Okay, was there another question here? I thought I saw a hand up. Here's a question.
My name's Tom Arnold and I'm at EI alum. My question is on following on from that Letta and Draghi comments. From your experience, is it strange how little focus there is on the economy compared to like this year, or like migration, like geopolitical matters? And do you think it's a concern in the long term, given Europe's growth and productivity compared to like the States, for example? It's not really a focus.
Again, two very different questions.
I agree with you. I think there has been insufficient focus on the economy. Let's take an example. One of the three priorities of this commission was digital. But what are we doing? We are regulating the risks of digital. That's what aging societies are doing. They become very concerned with risk, sorry. And I've been meeting a couple of months ago with 25 younger people in digital, and they were saying, okay, if you understand correctly, European Union is regulating the risk and the growth we are then having in the United States. And I think that's a division of labor which would be very unfortunate. So we have to ask, behind the headings digital, what do we mean? I asked them, what do you need? And the answer was, we need a banking union. Again, not only to distribute the risk, but we need real European banks who can accompany us in our growth strategy in the continent, which currently is not happening because, for example, the rule to make use of assets are very different. And secondly, we need a capital markets union. So I think the internal market is underdeveloped in the area of services, and that should be a big stress. Second, I'm very happy that Richard Corbett is listening in, not only a former member of European Parliament, but the head of the Labour delegation in the European Parliament, and also at the end, my deputy head of cabinet. Welcome, Richard. Maybe I'm underestimating the von der Leyen vote. There you maybe have also better information than I have. But still, I believe that this election is at risk. And it will not be easy to balance out the different interests. If the Greens would be supporting her, I would, let's say, I would be more optimistic. But the need to be dependent on some votes on the right could also lead to counter-reactions on the other side. And we've just seen in the last days that the European Parliament is taking the European Commission to court. There's also some personal aggressions against President von der Leyen because of the decision on Hungary to free 10 billion euros. Does this have consequences in voting behavior? I don't know. But what I wanted to say is this is not a foregone conclusion. And it definitely has become more difficult over time. And we have to see whether 3 political group support is sufficient. Personally, I believe it's not.
Allow me to ask an immediate follow-up question. Suppose Richard's wrong, you think you're optimistic.
Richard cannot be wrong. Richard is right. Always.
I think I've known Richard as well, a long time as well.
Yes.
And suppose you are over-optimistic as well.
Yes.
And there is then no scenario under which the Parliament is able to get the 361 votes to select Ursula. What happens then?
Yeah, normally Parliament doesn't commit 2 crimes in a row. So if Parliament did not confirm the first proposal for Commission President, I think the second has a much better chance.
Right.
But the formal answer is the European Council would need to make a new proposal within 4 weeks' time.
And with that formal answer, would you care to speculate on who Plan B is?
Not when it's transmitted outside, but I have an idea. Yeah.
Right, so watch this space. Any further questions?
Yeah, we have more questions. Question from Anthony, an LSE external alum. How might the election campaigns and the post-election negotiations impact on EU foreign policy, with splits between the countries on the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, and the US-China competition? Is there a path to a more coherent and powerful EU which can make its own strategic autonomy?
I think we better take that question on its own.
Yes. Okay. Maybe let me first say that the European Parliament on those issues is very united. I mean, Parliament supported Ukraine, I would say, with 90% plus of its members, which was surprising. So Richard is right, maybe sometimes I'm a pessimist. But also would like to acknowledge that the leader of the left group, Martin Schirdewan, went out in plenary and clearly condemned the Russian aggression against Ukraine. So very strong majority. I think also on China, there is a broad consensus, which is nowadays much more skeptical on China, which goes also across political lines. For the European Union, major integration decisions are normally taken with the back to the wall and looking into the abyss. And why is this? Because for member states' head of government, this means they have to give up sovereignty. Do they like to give up sovereignty? No. What does sovereignty mean? Sovereignty means they decide. So giving up sovereignty means we decide together, 27. So we have seen this during the financial crisis. They were sitting together on Saturdays and Sundays. And only when they were told that if you don't decide, we cannot guarantee that banks are opening on Monday, they said, okay, if that's the case, then we are ready to pool sufficient resources. So back to the wall, looking into the abyss. So foreign affairs, security and defense. Unfortunately, we might get pretty close to in such a situation. We could even argue we're already there with the Russian attack on Ukraine. But if we have additional problems on the United States alliance and with NATO, we are definitely there. So it could be that this is the next big field of integration, which is also why I've been working on defense recently. My personal view is that the European Council is a kind of collective presidency of the European Union. And I would give, it was spontaneous support. And I would give to the European Council, on the basis of a Commission proposal, the possibility to take qualified majority decisions on foreign affairs, security and defense. That fits systemically, because when we look at the US model or at the French model, that's a kind of presidential function, and it doesn't disturb the legislative functioning of the European Union. And there is enough legitimacy and power around the table when these kind of decisions are needed. So that's what I would be hoping for.
To agree.
Yeah, it's actually a follow-up question. In how far do you think that will translate into the European Action Service? And I'm Joanna, and I study
Joanna,
and I study global politics.
okay. Maybe ask your question.
Let's go back to the first question that you asked, actually, on a more theoretical level. Because you mentioned that, well, there's a difference between you identify some agendas in different regions of Europe as opposed to national elections. But how do they differ, these patterns differ from national elections? If you look at, for instance, the election in Germany, where the Greens had a prominent, outstanding performance. We'll look at elections in Italy and Spain even. You know, could you elaborate a bit more on that, how these agendas differ from national elections or national?
Okay, maybe I start with the question on the External Action Service. I think the External Action Service has been a success abroad. That means in the offices, let's say we could call it in the embassies around the world. Why? Because the European ambassador is chairing the other ambassadors, doing a function of coordination. We're all becoming much stronger. I don't think that the External Action Service has been a success in Brussels, because it has led to a lot of turf wars between the Commission and the External Action Service services. And where's our strength in foreign affairs? It's not in traditional foreign affairs. It's in the combination with all the other policy elements. So with trade, even with regulation and so on. So to separate them out, here classical foreign policy and there the other tools, from my point of view, doesn't make sense. So I would reintegrate the External Action Service into the European Commission. So that's kind of more community. But at the same time, I would give the European Council a say on the major decisions in the area with qualified majority, which you could say would be a step more into the intergovernmental part of the Union. So that's where I would try and would re-establish the balance, if anybody would ask me, except you. Then on the European elections, are they just completely separate elections or what are they? In 2000, let's say, the introduction of Spitzenkandidaten has had an effect, but a limited effect. But there were 12% of the voters who were saying that this was for them the decisive issue. Okay, we can say 12% is not a lot, but
He's 88 behind.
Huh?
He's 88% behind.
But there are 12% who say for them it's very important. Secondly, we have seen 2019 for the first time, and maybe it had also to do with the Brexit experience, that suddenly there was a lot of grassroots interest. So we provided as European Parliament a platform where people could connect with their email address and say, look, I want to campaign, I want to be active, and I want material from you. So we had 300,000 people who got linked up to the European Parliament, who we provided with material across the board. We also started a website called What Europe Does For Me. So try to get them in a better position to argue whatever they wanted to argue, but some basic material. 300,000 is not bad. So it was the first time that I had the impression that it was not just the European Union dealing with national institutions, but you had a direct linkage to the citizens. What we could also see was that suddenly NGOs and associations and also business and trade unions were getting active. The two examples from Germany I know and I like is Lufthansa put on their airplanes the date of the European elections. Don't have to do that. And Bayern Munich, when they had the cup final, put their stadium in blue, which if you know German football is a big step because Bayern Munich is red and the traditional competitor 1860 Munich is blue. So for Bayern Munich to put their stadium in blue and say, look, please go to vote and this is the election day, that was a step. What I want to say is we start to see signs of civil society engagement supported by European institutions. But for the first time, I didn't have the impression that this is just, a problem of the European institutions and the citizens, okay, they go to vote or not, but let's say without big emotion.
And yet the turnout was what, 43%?
No, the turnout, in 2000, we had, the turnout was going down since 79, but the downward trend was stopped in 2014, first time Spitzenkandidat, at the level of 42 point something, and it went up in 2019 by 8 percentage points, which is 20% to above 50%. But in reality, if we compare historical figures, it is much higher because the countries from Central Eastern Europe who are now in the average have, even for their national elections, partly very, very bad participation figures. I mean, if you look at Slovakia, they can do elections with 20-some% or 30-some% participation. So we can't compare apples. We can't compare apples with peaches. So if we had to look at historical data, we would need to compare to the historical composition. But anyhow, first time massive trend reversal plus 8 points. And therefore, if we were to have this for a second time in 2024, we have to wait. I think all those in science engaged in writing articles about second order elections would need to think again.
I'll tell Simon Hicks next time we see him.
I know Simon for a very long time, yes. We always were in competition for our figures, and normally mine were better than his.
I'll tell Simon that as well.
I told him directly in 99.
One here, one over there.
There's another question by Anthony, which is an alum. How might the elections impact on agriculture and the environment? And is there a path to regain EU leadership on climate change and a just transition from fossil fuels?
I think that's such a big question.
Yeah, ask this question to a non-expert, but still I hope I can give a meaningful answer. The question is, I think nobody's questioning the targets, but the question in front of us is how do we get it done without making it a growth program for the extreme right? We had the debate in Germany about the heating law. At the beginning, I think the AfD was about 10%. At the end, it was about 20%. And why is this? 51% of Germans said, I can't afford it. I have a house which is maybe unrenovated or older. I'm getting bankrupt if I do what is expected to me. So what I want to say is we have to find a way to make this in a way that is socially acceptable and that is not overburdening certain parts. And I would like to add that is not deepening the divide between big cities and countryside. Because if it is true that one of the underlying factors of the growth of the extreme right is the divide between big cities and countryside, we have to be very careful with individual measures that put additional burden on the countryside. Because they might destabilize our system, which is not an outcome we want to have. So it is not optimization of one unknown. We have to optimize not just the climate, not just on climate, we also have to remain socially sensitive, and we have to keep our political system stable. And that's much more challenging.
So we can go for the full Rumsfeld of many unknowns. I think there was a question right at the back.
Yeah, it was essentially the same. I was wondering what the outcome of the elections would have as an impact on the progress made of the Green Deal, but the answer is just as valid.
Yeah, maybe I could add to this. I think the next 5 years maybe can be put on under the heading "Make the Green Deal work." So, for example, it's great if you have a lot of renewable energy, but you might need to have a second look at your grid, whether in fact you can use this, whether you can connect it, whether you can get it to where it is needed. And I think there are open issues. If I think about Germany, the renewable energy is in the north, the industry is in the south, and we don't have the correct connections. So I would say there is a huge agenda still out there. The targets will not be put into question, I'm convinced. But now we have to make it work, and I think that can be the heading for the second for the next legislature.
Are there any more questions? If not, I have a couple of, sorry.
I'm Hideki Sato from the Financial Markets Group, the Department of Finance, LSE. Visiting things. I have a very general question about the what do you think about the two dichotomy, to divide it line between the stability and growth? So as a follow a little bit about the previous questions, the capital markets union, it's a growth friendly policy, but the banking union is a very stringent vision. So what do you think of the future prospect for the more flexible discretion, which is apart from the too much jurisdiction, the tons of areas of the regulation directives or recommendation sent from the European Commission, or more integrity-based approach?
Again, I'm not an expert on financial markets, but I think we have also learned that too much flexibility in financial markets can be very expensive as well. And we are now seeing the UK, I think, is already at 100% debt to GDP. The United States is 100% debt to GDP. So relatively, yeah. So relatively speaking, we are doing well in the Eurozone. We have 90% debt to GDP, but it's not a big difference. So how would we cover another financial crisis? And in Britain, London, would you be able to stomach another financial crisis in the system? So I think, yes, growth is good, but I think the heading has to be, where are still opportunities for growth without debt? Because we have been exploiting over the last years still additional debt possibilities, but I think we are coming to a limit. And when you're living in Belgium, you see that once you are at 120% debt to GDP or 130% debt to GDP, you basically lost your political sovereignty. And you're not investing anymore, you're just, you're paying the interest and you have to pay back, but you're not a free country anymore. And you can see this in Belgium every day. So we have to be, I think we have exploited, and that's why Next Generation EU, the member states came up with a genius idea, 300 billion of additional debt, but not on our balance sheets. They go onto the balance sheet of the European Union, but we're also not giving them own resources to pay it back. It's a genius idea. You can do it once, but I would say you cannot do it too often.
Can't repeat the trick. That brings me on to a question I have. You mentioned that Parliament gained from the 2019 elections, where you talked about having a degree of power to initiate. However, the Parliament lost in Next Generation EU because it was decided intergovernmentally. The Parliament sidelined in it. I know this because I've been doing all this for the Budget Committee. Is the Parliament likely to recover some of its power as half of the budgetary authority, or is that particular genie out of the bottle and why the Parliament is not going to recover it?
I think when we look at institutional developments, then the budgetary power has rather been weakened. Probably already in the 2009 Lisbon Treaty, that was not an area where it did expand. Because now the council can sit us out and say, okay, we don't have an agreement, then we go to 1/12, and then Parliament is becoming very nervous. The truth of the story is, of course, with Next Generation EU, that this was something which was very much asked by the European Parliament. We wanted this, especially also by our president at the time, David Sassoli. But it's true that especially also the control mechanisms and how this is spent are not clear. So I think
This is my current project.
yeah, so I think it was necessary, but it needs to be corrected. And the danger is, of course, there, if the trick is working once, they will try it again. And that's something I had in my original script here, but I didn't say. You know, will this be repeated? I think the temptation is there. Are the topics there? Definitely, we could say climate change, or we could say defense. But please then with own resources. And that's the fight the Parliament needs to win over time. Alain Lamassoure has been working a lot on this over many years, and we've been asking him to commission a paper for the Martin Center on resources.
There is a difficulty in all of this, which is, came home to me yesterday when I gave a seminar on the future of the budget. And one of the things I was trying to push for was to say the Parliament needs to be brought more into it. And somebody said to me from the audience, yes, but the new Parliament, do you really want them involved in budgetary matters?
Yeah.
Given that there's going to be all these radicals coming in, IFD, etc. I said to her, yes, but aren't you democratic?
Now, this argument we know for decades. You know, for these kind of people, we were always too unruly. I haven't heard from the member state side that in any situation that they thought it was a great idea to give us more budgetary powers. It's very simple. You have to grab them, you have to fight for them, you have to get them. They will not do it freely. We have to find the right mechanism to assure proper budgetary control, also on those new instruments for Parliament.
Right, one very last question. You haven't mentioned committees, because the committee structure is important in the Parliament, and for the most part, it's chaired by the mainstream, if I can call them that, groups. I think Budges are maybe an exception with having a chair of Bjorn van Overpelt, who's ECR. If your predictions or projections, as we call it that, from the Parliament are correct, will the allocation of chairs of committees be a problem?
Let's say the projections I've made are basically on the basis of available figures. It's not a calculation, different sources available for them, plus some correction or assumptions on, you know, those who don't yet have affiliations where they go. But it's basically what the figures are saying for the moment. In principle, positions in Parliament are distributing according to the DON principle, and in principle to all the groups. In recent years, the ID group has not been receiving important positions of responsibility. And on the ECR side, it depended a bit on the quality, let's say, of the candidates proposed. And the chair of the budget committee is excellent, it's outstanding. One of the best.
Just so you know, he's an excellent next Belgian finance minister.
Yeah, exactly. He's one of the best chairs of the budget committee, at least I've seen, so there was no issue. We have to say the DONT agreement is a gentleman's agreement. So
no women? No women?
No women or gentlemen? Yeah, I think DONT was a man. You can't change him retrospectively and don't want to do that either, but it's a question who is integrated into that agreement, who is not. There's no obligation by members of Parliament to vote somebody into office. So if somebody really doesn't have the trust or is under suspicion to want to destroy the system, you cannot force members of Parliament to vote these people into office.
Okay, great. I think we've reached our witching hour, and I hope you've enjoyed this fascinating discussion, because I've been learning things about the Parliament I didn't know, and I'm sure you have as well. I would like to thank Klaus very warmly for been willing to engage with so many tricky questions. And the only way to resolve this is to give them the round of applause.